Just off the city centre. Shaped by nature, landscaped by men. This is Bukit Brown Cemetery. At rest are the country's forefathers, whose collective timelines span 150 years of our development into modern Singapore. Their tombstones are touchstones in living memory for a new generation of descendants. This is our history from the hills. Raffles Place, the commercial heart of Singapore. The history of Singapore's financial success takes root here. As a newly declared Crown colony engaged in entrepôt trade, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 heralded an era of prosperity for Singapore.
The need for a banking cost central to trade, and banking was essentially, as we know it, was essentially a European, British function.
With the booming economy at their doorstep, Singapore's pioneer traders and businessmen were hungry for a piece of the action. To carve their niche in the market, these local entrepreneurs had to find ways and means to raise capital.
Lots and lots of small banks developing out of the Qian Zhuang, which also a kind of credit system. And your pawn shops is another you deposit your goods there, it gives you a chit tail, gives you the money, you know. That's what it's all about. Basically, it's to raise capital.
To better manage operations of their banks, bank owners worked with a select group of locals known as compradors. Today, Noreen Chan visits Bukit Brown for the first time with her guide and uncle, Chia Chien Chai. They make their first stop at the grave of Noreen's great-grandfather, Mr. Chia Keng Tai.
It's quite exciting, you know. I've lived near this place for so many years.
But you've never been here?
Never been. So this is going to be quite an experience.
Yeah, see, you have to walk through the heavy undergrowth.
Well, as long as there are no snakes.
Chia Keng Tai was a comprador with the Mercantile Bank, which was later acquired by the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank.
I see the photos.
Yeah, they're quite clear. There are even the names of your grandparents, your grandmother is here. In English.
Yes, in English. Was it unusual?
Yeah, I think so.
This is really something, at long last, to be actually seeing the grave, and not just through photographs.
Yeah.
What I understand was that Chia Hu Tiam was a comprador, and when he retired, his son Chia Keng Tai took over, and from there it passed to his other son, Chia Keng Chin. So there was a strong line of compradors in that particular family. But as a matter of fact, in the Malacca branch of my family, my other great-grandfather, Tan Chong Lek, was the comprador of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank in Malacca. So I really have three ancestors who were compradors. I understood the compradors to be what we would nowadays call business development managers. Their job was the go-between between the colonial governors of the bank and the local population.
Compradors like Capitan China also come from the Portuguese period. Again, it is a question of the Europeans needing Asians to help them trade at the local level. I suppose the start of it comes from the fact that there were just so few Europeans. And the trade was very extensive. You had to deal with a lot of local small traders or the producers of the goods that you want to buy. You need a lot of people. At that level, trading is labor intensive. And there was simply not enough Portuguese or Dutchmen or Englishmen to do all that. So that is one reason why they turned to the Chinese, the Arabs, and the Indians to provide them with that help. But when it comes to the China trade, then you need Chinese to be your compradors. So compradors are not limited to Chinese. There are other compradors, Arabs and Indians as well. But for the China trade, anything to do with the Chinese trading, you need Chinese to be your comprador. So many dialect groups, so many languages, written language is so difficult. How many Europeans can actually learn to deal with it, you know?
Growing up, Noreen was fed on an unending diet of family history by her grandmother.
Actually, everything I know about Kong Chua Keng Tai is from Mama. I only have his photographs and I have the stories, but of course I never knew him personally. He passed away before I was born.
Oh, okay.
But what do you remember about him?
Yeah, I think I saw him last when I was probably around 10 or so. I think by the time he was already retired, I think he probably retired at 40 or something like that.
But he was very meticulous. All his pencils, and this is what my mother and also Uncle Colin would say, would be all in a neat row. He would have the HB pencils together and then the 2B pencils together and all the erasers together, and you couldn't mess them up. He would get very upset if you messed them up. And if you were good, he says as a child, if you were good, he would let you choose a pencil from his collection. Well, it seems he was very strict. My mom says he used to listen in on phone calls. So sometimes when her admirers called her, he would listen in. And there was once or twice where they had less than complimentary things to say about him. And unfortunately, he overheard.
Years on, what does the current generation like Noreen and Chia Chien Chai retain of their past?
Stone lions traditionally guard the entrances to important buildings. The Chinese strongly believe that stone lions such as these would protect them in the afterworld as they do for the living.
Singapore's transformation from a sleepy fishing village to a prosperous trading centre is a story that is mirrored in the lives of its pioneers. One such pioneer is Mr. Tan Eng Kiam. Tan Keng Lek recalls some of his grandfather's past achievements.
This is the tomb of my grandfather, Tan Eng Kiam. Grandfather is a successful businessman, a banker, philanthropist. He's also a scholar, a poet. Most of what we know about him come from his writing. Actually, I never met him. And my father says he's a man of few words. He doesn't socialize much, but given that it's a bit unusual that a person who didn't talk much and socialize much managed to do so much for society. He came to Singapore alone as a young chap, I think maybe 16 or 17 years old, and started off very humbly, like most migrants of that time. And then slowly he built up his so-called reputation, his work portfolio, and I think he was employed by some prominent businessmen of the time, and slowly he has some capital of his own. Then he started businesses.
At his peak, Tan Eng Kiam ran numerous businesses, among them banks.
Banking comes later. I think he was in the rubber trading business first. Then when he makes his money, then the time I think he raised funds. He's one of the fundraiser of one of the three banks that is predate OCBC, one of the three banks. I think it's Huashang Bank. He helped form the bank through a few investors. And subsequently, the merged to become OCBC Bank, and he became the first general manager of OCBC.
Tan Eng Kiam had the foresight to understand that for the locals to ride on Singapore's monumental growth, the local banks had to join arms.
When several of these already merged smaller groups finally agreed to have the Huaqiao Yinghang, that was the biggest at that time, and that was big enough to, at least in the eyes of the Chinese, big enough to compete with the Chartered Bank and Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. But that, as I said, took them a long while. There was, 1920s before they really got going. That's very late.
Over on another part of Bukit Brown, Noreen Chan and her uncle march on to another tomb. This time in search of Noreen's great-great-grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Chia Hu Tiam.
That's interesting. Not only did they put her name, Madam Yolan Yo, they put in brackets Nyonya Tawi.
What does Tawi mean?
Actually, Tawi is a contraction of Betawi or Batavia, which was the old name for Jakarta. So Mama told me that Mak Chocho was from Jakarta. So she would have come from that branch of Indonesian Chinese Peranakans. But isn't that interesting? I never realized they would put nicknames onto a grave. And the photograph is completely gone.
Yeah, I think it's too old. Well, it was sort of visible earlier, but the color went off straight away.
But from her old photos, she looked very fierce.
Chia Hu Tiam inherited the role of the comprador at the Mercantile Bank shortly after his father, Chia Leong Chuan, passed away in 1889.
The secret of the company's success is to have a set of very loyal compradors working for them, who are dedicated to the company, loyal to the company, but they're dedicated because they are themselves making money for themselves separately, and you allow that. It's an understanding. So much is yours as long as you're loyal to the company. And once you have that understanding and the trust, it could be a very good relationship for sometimes generations.
She remembers Chia Hu Tiam as being a very stern man, actually very stingy, because he grew up poor. In fact, one of his stories was that he and his brother would have to go around collecting stray eggs that were laid by hens and ducks under the bushes or something like that. They were so poor that they had to collect those eggs either to eat or to sell. So his was a rags to riches story, but he never forgot he was poor, so he didn't like to spend too much money.
Another rags to riches story that cannot be forgotten is that of founding entrepreneur Chew Boon Lay. Chew Boon Lay left China for Siam as a teenager. After years of toil, he sailed for Singapore on an old junk he bought with the money made. Ong Tui Im, co-author of a book on Chew Boon Lay's history, recounts his remarkable journey here.
The other ancestor on my mother's side would be Chew Boon Lay. And everybody started talking about the snake incident. And I said, what snake incident? And then they recounted to me that Chew Boon Lay traveled from China to Bangkok, from Bangkok to Singapore. But on the second part of the journey, suddenly the boat sprang a leak. And everybody was bailing out water. And then the next thing they knew, the water level more or less stayed. It did not rise. So they were wondering, what divine sign is this? So after the boat reached Singapore, apparently they went to inspect the boat. They found a leak. They found a big gap at the bottom of the boat, but somehow a snake was coiled inside, completely blocking the flow of water. Well, this is what I heard, and I didn't quite believe it, but you know. And then everybody was so interested. So they told me, hey, you're free, you're free, you better write a book.
A book may have assured that Chew Boon Lay's legacy was left for posterity. But as co-author, Chew Keng Chuan found out history is all relative.
5-6 years before we did the book, I did receive a call from somebody from the Boon Lay constituency who wanted to find out more about Chew Boon Lay's history. And they knew very little. I mean, they knew shockingly little, but perhaps not so shocking because, I mean, after all, this history had not been really compiled. So they did not even realize that Jalan Boon Lay was named after a person. They thought it was named after a set of virtues, because that's what the character meant. And not as a person. But then someone had directed them to me, and so they called me in my office and to ask me about Chew Boon Lay, and I was a bit embarrassed because I really had very little to tell them.
Chew Boon Lay was a trailblazer. He was among the first local traders to have ventured into manufacturing.
What he did that was unusual as a one of these pioneering Singaporeans was that he actually, rather than just trading and building his fortunes that way, he actually set up a factory, and it was a biscuit manufacturing factory. And this is called the Ho Ho Biscuit Factory. So it was one of the largest manufacturing concerns in its day. It was even written up as an exemplary model of a business in 1923 by a British journal. Its products were known in Singapore and Malaya and even in Indonesia. In Jakarta, which at that time was called Batavia.
With the success of Ho Ho Biscuit, Chew Boon Lay acquired land in the western part of Singapore. He began to expand upon his empire.
Besides the biscuit business, he also had rubber plantations. So he had 3 rubber plantations. He had one in Jurong, quite large. I'm told about 1,000 acres of what is now in Jurong. And he actually made a road through his estate, and that road is now Jalan Boon Lay. And some side roads, which he named after 2 of his grandsons, Chin Bee Road and Chin Chong Road, which does not exist anymore. there's an official soil in Singapore called Chew Boon Lay soil. I'm not sure why that's so. It probably was found in his estate in abundance, and so they name it after him.
What began as Keng Chuan's quest to uncover Chew Boon Lay's past will lead him to a small secret about himself.
The 8 Immortals are popular figurines in Chinese mythology who are believed to have attained immortality through virtuous acts. Such beliefs are carved in tombstones in hope that they ensure good health, longevity, and prosperity for future generations.
After uncovering much information on Chew Boon Lay, Keng Chuan was spurred on to learn more about his grandfather, Chew Hock Seng, Boon Lay's elder son.
I knew that Chew Hock Seng's grave was there as well, but I didn't know exactly where it was. And some cousins said, oh yeah, they don't remember and they didn't take me there, but you know, we didn't quite get around to doing it. So it was only last year when after, you know, I got to know the Phuket Brownies, I was asking Raymond, do you know where Chew Hock Seng's grave is? And he said, oh yes, I do. And he brought me there, and in fact, it was completely overgrown. I would never have been able to locate it. And it was a very nice discovery for me to locate the grave.
As it turns out, Keng Chuan's inaugural visit coincided with Chew Hock Seng's death anniversary and further unravelling.
This is my grandfather's tomb. So you can see here, there are the names of his daughters and his sons. 3 sons. My father's the middle son, Chew Chin Cheong. And then his granddaughters, my father is the only one of his sons that had kids. So at that time of his death, he had 4 granddaughters, my 4 sisters, Keng Chu, Keng Ling, Keng Im, and Keng Suan. My name is missing because I was still in my mother's stomach at that point in time. He died in April. I was born in December. So interestingly, when I look at the Chinese characters, my name is still missing, but there's a reference to a possibility of myself being there. There's the Chinese characters of my sister's names, and after my last sister's name, Keng Suan, there's a Tan, which is etc. So I guess I'm the etc.
Whilst Keng Chuan contemplates his presence in time, Noreen and Mr. Cha journeys on to uncover more about their Comprador forefathers, to where the ancestral home, Rosedale, used to stand.
It's hard to imagine now, though. All you see is this big condo.
Yeah, actually it's new, because it went all the way up to there. And then the main entrance was somewhere down there, somewhere in the middle.
So let me get it right. So the house was on the corner here, and extended all the way, let's say, to that second condo there, and all the way up to St. Thomas Walk over there. Very huge piece of land.
Rosedale was the estate of Comprador Chia. The rambling premises with its tennis court speaks of the lifestyle that the compradors of colonial past used to lead. Negotiating the gap between locals and the colonial governors had its many perks.
Chia King Tai, that was my grandmother's father, was a man of many interests. Not only was he a comprador, he loved playing tennis. He started the first classical orchestra in Singapore. His hobby was speedboats. He liked racing. He kept dogs. He went hunting with the colonial governors. So the real typical example of what we would call the King's Chinese. Very, on the one hand, very traditional, and then on the other hand, very Western.
The grandeur of Rosedale may be a thing of the past, but the artifacts within have come to be treasured by Chia Keng Tai's family.
So these are some of the furniture that used to be in Rosedale. So it's the inlaid blackwood, which I don't think you can find anymore nowadays. It's probably like 200 years old or something. So it's like with the blackwood marble below. And then we also have some of these Venetian mirrors, which used to have photographs inside, but we took out the photos and turned them back into mirrors. This is vase here. There were a pair. So my father had one, and my uncle, the one who maintains the graves at Bukit Brown, he kept the other pair, probably belonged to Chia Hu Tiam as well. It just passed down to us. Up there you can see a photo of my father who passed away about 15 years ago, I guess. And you notice this dragon, the gilded dragon, it was actually at the base of the staircase. You call it the banister, so it was right at the end of it.
While some people leave artifacts to their descendants, others leave a legacy. Decades after Tan Ean Kiam made his mark, he continues to be remembered for his contribution.
From his writing, you can see he's very humble. He's always very self-deprecating, saying, oh, I didn't do this. And then he sort of is write things to criticize himself, my failing in this, my failing in that. You know? So we see, oh, this guy is a really, really humble guy. Also his name, Ean Kiam. Kiam means modesty or humble. So this, I think, that's why we think of him as a person. Of course, subsequently he contributed to society. He also set up a foundation. I mean, in his will, he put 1/10 of his wealth as a foundation, which is still survive today.
It was not until we did the book on Chew Boon Lay, my cousin, my aunt, and myself were the three editors of this book on Chew Boon Lay, that I really found out a huge wealth of very interesting information, little stories and recollections and memories of Chew Boon Lay that were floating around, but we had managed to put it all together and compile it into a book.
From the compilation of stories of Chew Boon Lay to the foundation of Tan Ean Kiam and the artifacts from Rosedale. All these point not just to the commercially successful history of Singapore, but just as rich is its significance to our past.
The history of our family is also the history of Singapore. It's the history of how Singapore has changed in all aspects, physically, socially, demographically. If you want to know about how your country has changed, you need to know how your family has changed through the years. That would be my message.